Upon hearing the news, crowds assembled in front of the White House all across the United States, as well as other parts of the planet, to celebrate the demise of the most wanted man on the planet. But before we start rejoicing over slaying the terrorist giant, I think it's necessary to provide a little context about what happened last night and the rise and fall of Osama bin Laden and the crime of the century that was perpetrated on the American people. And by crime of the century, I'm not referring to 9/11. In 2004, former Bush Secretary of Commerce Paul O'Neill contributed to a book titled The Price of Loyalty, written by Ron Suskind, that contains some explosive allegations against George W. Bush. In an interview that year with 60 Minutes, O'Neill let the cat out of the bag on what Bush was most interested in on day one after his appointment by the Supreme Court as president. Take a look.
In the very beginning, there was a conviction that Saddam Hussein was a bad person and that he needed to go.
He says that going after Saddam Hussein was topic A 10 days after the inauguration, 8 months before September 11th.
Again, this was just after he was sworn into office and long before 9/11. Bush was telling his people to start drawing up plans to invade Iraq. Around the same time, a trial was unfolding in New York City against 4 men who were accused of blowing up the Kenyan and Tanzanian embassies back in 2008. But the FBI wasn't as interested in the operatives on trial. They wanted the big fish. They wanted to put Osama bin Laden himself on trial for the bombings too. But in order to do that, in order to get a conviction against bin Laden, the FBI had to prove that the 4 men in the courtroom belonged to a vast terrorist network that bin Laden was at the top of. At that time, there was no evidence to support the existence of such an organization. In fact, those early videos that bin Laden released to the media showing his army of armed fighters with AK-47s, they were a fabrication. The fighters were essentially just actors told to bring their own guns for the shoot, according to the BBC. You see, bin Laden was nothing before 9/11. But the FBI needed to turn him into something. So this is all pre-9/11. They sought help from a man named Jamal al-Fadal, a former associate of bin Laden's back in the early 90s. And al-Fadal, thanks in large part to a hefty payment, courtesy of we the taxpayers, told the FBI what they wanted to hear. That bin Laden was an incredibly powerful and influential figure in the Arab world, that he was the puppet master of a legion of jihadis just waiting for orders to strike America. Al-Fadal told the FBI that the name of this organization was Al-Qaeda. Later, as Adam Curtis explained in his BBC documentary, The Power of Nightmares, Al-Fadal was lying, and the picture he drew of bin Laden was completely fictional. Take a look.
The reality was that bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri had become the focus of a loose association of disillusioned Islamist militants who were attracted by the new strategy. But there was no organization. These were militants who mostly planned their own operations and looked to bin Laden for funding and assistance. He was not their commander.
In fact, Al-Qaeda didn't exist at that time either. It was another fabrication by Jamal al-Fadal. Osama bin Laden himself would not use the term Al-Qaeda until after 9/11. After the United States had created the name, only then did bin Laden use the name Al-Qaeda for the little organization that he ran, and that was just for recruiting purposes. In other words, we created Al-Qaeda before bin Laden did. But beyond just paying for fake intelligence to convict bin Laden in the African embassy bombings, why else would George W. Bush want to attribute to bin Laden all these powers that he didn't actually have? Well, look no farther than Hollywood. Any good superhero, in order to be seen and known as a superhero, needs an equally powerful supervillain. And George W. Bush really wanted to be Superman. And in the post-9/11 bin Laden, he saw his perfect Lex Luthor. Bush had a big idea. He'd been campaigning on privatizing Social Security since the 70s, when he lost a congressional election, for example, on that topic. And to succeed, he needed the full support of the American people. He needed to reinvent himself as a larger-than-life character. He needed to become a wartime president like FDR or Lincoln. After all, he was already trying to figure out a way to invade Iraq. So when 9/11 happened, rather than pursuing bin Laden as the criminal that he was, rather than doing what Clinton did with Tim McVeigh, which was enlist the help of Interpol and the police and investigative agencies of various nations, a strategy, by the way, that nearly nabbed bin Laden when Bill Clinton did it with bin Laden, missing him just by 20 minutes. Instead of doing this, Bush decided to go to war. Again, what happened on 9/11 was a crime, not an act of war, and should have been dealt with through the global criminal justice system. And in the days after the 9/11 attacks, with the sympathy of the entire world behind us, Bush could have received as much cooperation as he needed to bring bin Laden to justice. Even Mullah Omar of Afghanistan offered to arrest bin Laden and turn him over for criminal prosecution. It would have been so easy to accept Omar's offer. Bring in bin Laden, dismantle the training camps, track down their attendees and sponsors, and launch an international effort to disassemble and render impotent al-Qaeda. It probably could have been done in a year or less. But Rove and Bush realized that if they simply branded Osama as the criminal thug that he was, the leader of an obscure Islamic mafia, basically, with fewer than a couple thousand serious members, they wouldn't have the supervillain they needed so that George W. Bush could become the superhero. If Bush only authorized a police action, he'd miss a golden opportunity to position himself as the battle commander in the war against evil incarnate. And so the White House began building the myth. Osama as the evil genius, Osama as the worldwide mastermind, even Osama as the Antichrist. And we responded to this criminal act by launching a war in Afghanistan, going after the very same guy Mullah Omar had agreed to arrest right after 9/11. But once the mythology took hold in America, once bin Laden became our official boogeyman, Bush could care less what happened to bin Laden. In fact, at that point, the longer bin Laden was alive, the easier it would be to keep the American people behind Bush's superhero war campaign all around the world that made his friends so rich. But Bush even admitted so much back in 2006.
The idea of focusing on one person really indicates to me people don't understand the scope of the mission. Terror is bigger than one person, so I don't know where he is. Nor, I just don't spend that much time on him. I'll be honest with you. I'm more.
Thanks for being honest with us. There's another piece of this puzzle, another component in the crime of the century that involved catapulting a relatively unknown radical millionaire to the stratosphere of evilldom so Bush could become a wartime president. And for that piece of the puzzle, we have to go a little farther back, even before 2001, even before Bush was made president by the Supreme Court in 2000. We have to go back to 1999 when Bush was still governor of Texas. Take a look at this 2006 sworn testimony at a congressional hearing from Cindy Sheehan, a woman who lost her son in the Iraq War.
The leadership of this country rushed us into an illegal invasion of another sovereign country on prefabricated and cherry-picked intelligence. Iraq was no threat to the United States of America, and the devastating sanctions and bombing raids against Iraq were working. As a matter of fact, in interviews in 1999 with respected journalists and longtime Bush family friend Mickey Herskowitz, then Governor George Bush stated, "One of the keys to being seen as a great leader is to be seen as commander-in-chief. My father had all this political capital built up when he drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and he wasted it. If I have a chance to invade, if I had that much capital, I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to get everything passed that I want to get passed, and I'm going to have a successful presidency," end quote. It looks like George Bush was ready to lead this country into an avoidable war even before he became president. From the expose of the Downing Street memo and the conversations with George Bush from 1999, it seems like the invasion of Iraq and the deaths of so many innocent people were preordained. It appears that my boy Casey was given a death sentence even before he joined the Army in May of 2000.
So is she right? Was the Iraq War all planned out back in 1999? And did Osama bin Laden do just exactly what President George W. Bush so badly needed when he attacked us on 9/11? For more on this, I'm joined by Russ Baker, editor of WhoWhatWhy.com and author of the book Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty. Russ, welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
First of all, first question, Cindy Sheehan's quote. I believe that you were the guy who talked to Mickey Herskowitz and had that information. Was that accurate, her testimony before Congress?
Yes, in fact, they asked me to come to Washington when they were having some informal hearings to talk about my reporting. I document this in great detail in my book, Family of Secrets. Basically, in 2004, when I was working on the book, I was able to meet with Mickey Herskowitz, a well-known and well-respected Texas journalist who had been George W. Bush's writing partner on a book project when Bush was running for president. Mickey had never before spoken to a member of the press of what transpired back then. He did speak with me, and in essence what he told me was that when they were writing partners and they were trying to put together what Bush was going to do as president, Bush really didn't have any ideas at all what he hoped to do as president. He was really stumped, and Mickey kept pushing him to provide something that they could use in a book. And finally, in an unguarded moment, Bush turned to him and said, "I'll tell you one thing I'm going to do." He said, "If I get a chance, I'm going to invade Iraq." And Mickey told me that he was stunned by this, and he said to Bush, "Why do you want to do that? What's your thinking?" And you might have thought he would say something about the story that Saddam wanted to take out his father, but instead he simply said, "Look, I've realized that you cannot have a successful presidency unless you have a war. When I was an advisor to my father, when my father was vice president and president, we were hearing all the time that this was absolutely critical. We looked at people like Margaret Thatcher with the Falklands Islands, and we looked at Reagan with Grenada, and my father with Panama, and we saw, boy, do those poll ratings go up, and we need to do that too."
That's absolutely incredible. So arguably what bin Laden did on 9/11 was the very best thing that could have happened to Bush. His credibility was down. People were questioning the legitimacy of his presidency. They were still counting the ballots, actually, in Florida. The newspaper consortium was. His poll ratings were in the toilet. It seems to have helped him tremendously. I'm curious, $2 trillion later, doesn't this now prove that, or at least indicate that what bin Laden did was the crime of the century rather than an act of war, and that Bush misreacted to it in order to get us into a war?
Well, you know, I think the whole, as you pointed out in the preamble, that the whole question of who Osama bin Laden is and what al-Qaeda is and so forth is enormously more complicated. I think the press of this country has done a terrible job, or perhaps they should say a non-existent job, of investigating what any of this means. And I think a perfect indication of that is that this story that I tell in Family of Secrets, all of it documented with footnotes, with direct quotes from Mickey Herskowitz, all tape recorded and so forth. The American mainstream media has refused to cover this story at all.
The story that George Bush was planning on having a war so that he could have political capital, so that he could privatize Social Security and the other things that were on his list that he had run for Congress back in the 70s on.
That's right, and I mean, you know, this, of course, in itself, I think would constitute a crime. In other words, creating a war under false pretenses. And then this explains perfectly, we see from Donald Rumsfeld's new memoirs, where he claims, I'm not sure we can trust him, but he says he couldn't figure out why Bush kept pushing him to look at Iraq when they wanted to look at Afghanistan. So Bush clearly had this on his mind, and it's so, you know, staggeringly cynical. And again, I mean, for the failure of the American media to tell this story to the American people, the real reason that we're in those places, it's a huge issue.
It is. It truly is. Russ Baker, thanks for the great investigative reporting you've been doing and for being on the program with us tonight.
Thank you, Tom.
In the last 10 years of his life, Osama bin Laden went from a religious nut millionaire with a few thousand loosely connected followers who shared his vision to take down America to an immortal icon, the arch enemy of the world's mightiest empire. All thanks to one lucky attack on a fateful September day and a corrupt response plan by the George W. Bush White House that leveraged that attack into political capital. Bin Laden is dead today, paid the ultimate price for his crime against America. But the bigger crime, the crime that George W. Bush hoodwinked us all into, is still going on. The wars are still raging. Americans and innocent civilians are still dying. But now that the supervillain is dead and the superhero is long gone and enjoying retirement in Texas, frankly, there's no reason to continue this absurd morality play. There's no reason to keep up the orchestrated good versus evil fight. There's no reason to let the crime of the century persist. Let's end these wars now for good.